I'm sending you a text, Dr. Brennan. Okay. Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Terrence Mitchell. I am the Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion
at Edinburgh, California, and Clarion University. We call it the New U. We recently released our name is Penn West, which will be active starting August 2022. I'm pleased to welcome again my colleague and the person who I think knows everything there is to know about intersectionality, Dr. Melinda Q. Brennan. I met Dr. Brennan at SUNY Uniata years ago, and we have so far graced 3 to 4 Pasha campuses with this discussion. I think you guys will find it very enlightening. Dr. Brennan will take care of her own introduction. She talks about the energy that comes from that. I really like to hear her talk about that. We are going to have this session recorded. So those of you who can come in now, it's great, but those of you who want to save it for later, please do feel free to do that. At the end of this time, Dr. Brennan will take a few questions, but no worries. If you need to get in touch with her afterwards, I have her contact information. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, Dr. Brennan.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much, Dr. Mitchell, and welcome everyone. Before all of the things, let me just say thank you to Edinburgh University for hosting and organizing the diversity dialogues and inviting me to speak and share with you some time today. So much as he said, I immediately introduced myself because I think it's part of the work. And so before I do anything else, let me tell you a bit about myself before we get into the topic. I am a gender studies and critical ethnic studies scholar. My formal education, like my experiential knowledge, taught me to situate myself before I speak on a topic. This practice gives us the opportunity to root ourselves before a deep dive, to model some productive vulnerability, and to tell our audience who we are and how we relate to what we're thinking about. Perhaps most importantly, it's an opportunity for us to start to build trust with those who don't know us at all. It's an ethical imperative for me, so I warmly invite you to come along. I'm a jumble of parts and pieces like all of you. I come back home to many communities, identities, and experiences. Some of these pieces are privileged. Some of them put me on the margins. I do my best to live through all of them most of the time. These elements of self and community include being light-skinned, a woman, a Latina, Mexican-American, cisgender, queer, a person with multiple disabilities, currently middle class with previous experience of poverty, a leader, an educator, a scholar, functionally first generation, a caregiver, a community organizer, feminist and anti-racist, an activist. I've been the only insert part of my identity in a group or a meeting or an event for a long time. I've been formally discriminated against. I've been the presumed privileged person in the room who spoke as an ally. I've been doing diversity, equity, inclusion work for over a decade, and I've been doing marginalized community building and social justice work for nearly 20 years. I tell you all of this to say that I've had life experiences, I have expertise, I've done significant work, and I'll still never be able to speak to the needs of everyone. I will always have a gap between myself and another person, no matter how similar we may seem. It would be dishonest or arrogant to say otherwise, and I don't make promises that I can't keep. So I'm here to mobilize the knowledge and insight I have access to be as helpful as possible. My priorities remain centered on marginalized folks, social justice, and community building. The more effort and resources provided to them and for them, the more the whole organization or the culture rises. I know this to be true, and this is why I do the work. Now, before we get into the title line issues of the talk, I want to talk about a few principles, only 3. I hope that you've got a sense of me and my motivation thus far, and that my motivation is personal, political, professional, and operates out of a hope for a future where people are recognized as fully human and have access and assistance to all the help they need. I prioritize community in all of my work because that's the engine that keeps us connected during joyful moments and difficult times like now. So back to those 3 principles that will circulate throughout this talk. Each one will be engaged with an in-depth take as we go on, but I'd like to offer them at the top as a way for us to all slide down this hill together. So first up, the first of 3, Diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging are quality of life issues. I'm going to say it again because this statement defines my lifetime commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging work. And without recognizing the fundamental need for constant work in this area, as individuals and through institutions, our desires for justice may not be realized. So one more time, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging are quality of life issues. The second principle that I'd like to mention at the top is that habit can be harnessed as a powerful tool to leverage change. Major progressive shifts are exciting moments of celebratory change, and they include landmark court cases, social movements, and the moment when someone in power acknowledges the need for change. However, they're fairly rare within a whole lifetime. But what's far more common and often underestimated is the power of habit to shift your mindset and behavior. Habits of inclusion help you meet people where they are, gather support to a cause, inspire people from different backgrounds and experiences to work together. And all of that combined makes for a constant power to chip away at the things that are unjust. The transformation of habit, especially the ways we think of ourselves, others, and issues, changes our behavior and it models it for others. When you scale that up, it's a cultural shift. The third and final principle is something really simple. Language is thinking, and thinking is language. The way you think about a person, a group, or issue will inform your language choice. The language you use to communicate with yourself and others reveals how you think about people and also how you perceive the world. Given those three principles about diversity, equity, and inclusion and quality of life, the power of habit to make cultural change, and the tight connection between thinking and language, I want to now turn to the practical, to getting things done and making change happen to better support people. So now I'm going to turn to intersectionality as a concept, but with a practical take. Intersectionality means that in any given situation, you must consider the ways that multiple systems of oppression, be that racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, disability and ableism, class, and more, are operating together to cause the situation, a social problem, and harm groups of people stuck or caught at that intersection. Intersectionality is a liberatory concept. You can't address what you can't perceive. You look to a whole person, to the diversity within groups, and problem solving and working towards justice becomes much more difficult. For example, there can't be just issues of race and ethnicity, because then where would gender go? Where would sexuality go? You can't ignore or erase some parts of people within a community to make a tidy or exclusionary argument or social movement. Let me put it another way. Try your best not to use the violence of erasure, a common tool of oppressive systems and discriminatory people, against those who are marginalized. Be honest about the complexity of groups and people and human experiences of oppression, power, and privilege. So, what does this mean? Intersectionality in practical application supports a meaningful habit of inclusion. The links between language use, forming a habit of inclusion, and important daily shifts towards breaking down barriers are supported by thinking through an intersectional lens. Now, that's enough of the technical for a second, so we're going to slide into the first of several examples to work this out. How does this actually look in real life? So example one. All right, now at this first example of the positive impact of thinking intersectionally is about the difference that we can make. Let's say I meet a new colleague. I know their name and I meet them with other people around. As we do introductions, I state my pronouns, she, her, in the hopes that others will do the same. Why? Well, I'm a cisgender woman. My assigned sex at birth and my gender identity align in ways that make me normative, expected, but I have no idea what my new colleague's gender identity is, no matter how they look. And I also don't know if they've had an opportunity to say their pronouns out loud at work yet. Catch me there with a universal neutral pronoun. So I use the privilege I have as a cisgender woman to signal support and model behavior for others. My language, how I introduced myself, was intentionally inclusive because I don't know who I'm communicating with, and I do my work as an ally consistently. This is just a single limited example, the merest beginning of allyship work, but it clearly illustrates a few key things about how thinking informs language choice. I'm going to lay those out for you here, and there's 4 of them. I assume difference between people. 2, I know that I can't visually identify a person's gender identity. 3, I try to disengage with binary thinking, often also called black-white thinking, to illustrate racist harm here as well. I recognize, for example, that there are not only 2 genders. And the last one, 4, privilege operates at the expense of groups positioned at a disadvantage. In this case, making pronoun inclusion and introductions feel normal may provide additional room for people to express their gender if they feel safe to do so. Get me straight, so to speak. This is no hero move. This is an everyday habitual practice. It's a practice that becomes a routine way to be more inclusive. So now, after this first example, let's talk about intersectionality as practice. Intersectionality is negotiation of yourself and others, negotiation of circumstances, and interpersonal communications just as much as it is about macro level, structural, or institutional issues. Intersectionality is thinking about interlocking systems of power as intersecting identities or community memberships make certain needs or harms visible, hypervisible, or absolutely invisible. It's also true that intersecting identities can sometimes reveal the complex combinations of struggle, experience, and adaptation required of people on the margins. So before we move on to another example, I want to talk about a few models of how we view ourselves and others. There's 3 of these, one that I really endorse and one that we're going to work out more because it is not the kindest of all 3. First up, we can choose to invest in what is sociologically called a master status model of identity, a dominant component of self as an ever-present singular lens to view ourselves, others, and the world. This assumption about a controlling identity or an identity that's more dominant than all others within yourself is often related to the visual. What's the person's skin tone or hair texture? What about the person's body do you interpret as aligned with a particular gender or gender role? What about a person's body size or movement aligns with your interpretation of ability or disability, capacity, or competence? Visual elements about a person are not a good way to find out who they are, whether that's about race, ethnicity, gender, disability, class, sexuality, or other facets. Think of it this way. Can you look at a person's body and know their family lineage? Whether they are a caregiver, how much money they have in the bank, or their history related to life-sustaining resources? I offer a reflection question to help do this work. What would happen if you explored the pieces of yourself, those that have visual elements, and the majority that also do not? Would you feel exposed and misinterpreted only by the visual? Would you feel that the important components of who you were unnecessarily minimized if they weren't visual? So that's model number 1. Model number 2, and this is the one that I like best, which will probably be obvious by the end, is we can instead choose a combined, compound, or constellation of identity. In other words, a holistic view of ourselves and others, working to not leave any pieces of ourselves or others for that matter behind. It's a generous treatment of self and offers others the grace to be as much of themselves as they would like to or feel safe sharing. Outcomes of the combined, compound, or constellation of identity include few expectations of sameness or similarity, less tense course corrections and conversation because there's a lack of assumptions, delight and curiosity in differences, and an orientation of openness because you are always learning about others as they share themselves with you. Here's an example to flesh this one out. You have a friend who you share an identity with. In this case, let's make it a racial or ethnic community membership. As you talk, you figure out just how rich your connection is. You celebrate a holiday similarly, but the menu is very different. Your family is structured differently, so that means some familial experiences are very different. You learn together and support each other to undo socialization that's racist, and what makes you both have different concerns about being misperceived or devalued. You support each other through and across your differences, as well as your similarities, and that connection is deep without demanding that you be the same together. You trust each other with the tender bits of your differences. The two of you get to grow together. While this previous way of navigating difference is the one that I endorse, the next example, the last example of a model, is frequent and a sad outcome from a lack of trust, which is, might I add, not the responsibility of the marginalized person. We can choose to, and this is the model, compartmentalize ourselves and code switch between different linguistic styles, languages, and levels of openness and familiarity. We can be separate people across different groups and circumstances. This takes significant labor and effort, especially if we feel forced to do this kind of switching and we switch off pieces of ourselves. One of the reasons this occurs is because we may not experience the necessary psychological safety to be all of ourselves. So we choose to reveal only what is not risky or fits the norm of the situation. This is most often directly linked to power imbalances. I'm going to give you another example to show you how this works. A person is at work or school. They watch someone come towards them who they recognize, are happy to be connected to, and exclaim joyfully in their relationship and familiarity, maybe with language or in a delivery that would surprise others who know them only through formalized, culturally dominant circumstances, only at work, only in the classroom, without the additional richness of other engagements. Then they look around. There's a third person that they both know who is there. The two nod, get quiet, and move away together, choosing not to engage the third party in the same way because that connection is not there. There might not be psychological safety in that relationship. That third person is more powerful, and the friends fear judgment and negative consequences by being their whole selves. Now, let me give you full disclosure, an additional note. I both compartmentalize and code switch because it has been so rare in my experience that I get to be my whole self in more formal work, educational environments. I do this to protect myself and view more fluid communication across difference as a gift that I provide to those who have earned access through consistent, inclusive behavior that makes me feel safe. Individuals should be free to control who gets to experience their whole selves. It is also true that those who are privileged or more powerful should work hard to provide psychological safety so that marginalized or less powerful folks can move freely to choose to express themselves. These are not the only models to navigate multiple identities, especially marginalized identities and community memberships, but they give us a sense of the work ahead. So now I want to move to habit and language and a second example. So far, we've been able to do some models and outcomes, work some examples together, and think about the connections between language and thinking. Now we're going to dive deeper into habit and language. Not unlike the pronoun example earlier, I do my best to think about disability and capacity when I communicate with others. The pandemic has caused so much stress, even if we were fortunate enough to not be directly impacted with bodily infection. This next section considers an example about how we think about work and how we approach others. As I told you at the top, I'm a person with multiple disabilities. In this section, I think it's more productive for me to not tell you what those are, but instead to have you focus on the outcomes about how I try to approach other people while offering support. So now here's the example so that we can work through it together. Let's say that there's a student that you know, generally earns very good grades, is present in their communication and towards others. You have a good relationship and respect each other. They disappear without any communication. During this time, I think we all can imagine many different reasons for their sudden change in behavior. But those specific permutations of the potential realities are not necessarily helpful. What follows might be helpful. Acknowledge that multiple life issues could be occurring at the same time for the student. Acknowledge that the student may not want to share intimate details of their life for a number of reasons, none of which necessarily involve you or your relationship. And acknowledge that the student may not reach out to advocate for themselves or ask for help. This could be because of many reasons, including cultural knowledge or expectations, gendered socializations, or just concerns about being judged. The points that I just mentioned are a product of intersectional thinking. I know I should not assume that I have enough information about this person. I know that I am not entitled to someone else's life story or current struggles. I know that it is rarely one life issue that makes someone retreat from work, responsibilities, or communication. Similarly, I know that there are often many factors that work against someone knowing that they need support or being able to communicate that need, including socialization and previous negative experiences. Because I hope someone would offer me this kind treatment, I do my best to provide the same. So then the question is, what do you do? Before you reach out, carefully consider that some of the non-specific factors could be related to bodily illness, mental health, the overlap and links between those, caregiving responsibilities, paid work and financial need, or sudden shift in living conditions, including basic need and security. In order to offer support, which can be connecting to resources and treating them as a whole human, I'd like you to think about several things before you'd even try to communicate. How many times might you reach out before you send that first communication? How often will you reach out once you do? And what factors shape that decision? How will you express your support in a way that you can live up to and is appropriate for your role? And what is your current capacity? If I have learned anything since the beginning of the pandemic, it has been that my own capacities are more limited because of the constant stressors that were not present in 2019 and life stressors that were present in 2019 that I could more easily or deftly handle. These days, I consider how much I have on my plate, who is in my network that I can provide help as part of a team to take the pressure off being a sole support, what resources I need to be knowledgeable about so that I can connect people with help quickly, what stressors I'm currently dealing with, and what is my best estimation of my emotional and psychological bandwidth. Then I reach out, and sometimes I'm wrong and I overextend. With practice, I improve these self-assessments in support of others, whether colleagues or students, community members, or my closest inner circle. While I broke down this particular example, could you connect language, thinking, and habit? Consider this. Through my own life experience, there were moments when I came to understand how many issues might be interacting simultaneously. I learned over and over again how limited my knowledge was of others, and that informed how carefully I approached other people's potential need. When I communicate, I mobilize my lack of assumptions as care and openness. As a habit, these communications get better results over time as I learn how to gently and firmly communicate balanced offers for support that also preserve my own well-being. There are people who will view this work primarily as a form of disability justice, and I see that. But more broadly, I perceive this work as an outcome of intersectionality in practice, of working at making people feel like they belong when things might be going wrong, of being less presumptuous and more humble in my own ability to assess what is happening and how much I can help. At this point, I want to turn to the very first principle I introduced, a deep belief of mine. Diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging are a quality of life issue. This means the more someone expects that they will have access to resources, be treated fairly, be intentionally included, feel that they belong, and that their differences from others will be treated with respect, they are more likely to succeed, to participate, to stay there and feel positively about that group of people. When I utilize the words quality of life, I mean that with positive, effective work to meaningfully include, to treat individuals respectfully as whole people, to be thoughtful in approach and language, to use habits of inclusion to produce cultural shifts. These practices make life more livable for students, workers, people we know. These practices make it much less likely that someone will be microaggressive, saying something purposefully or unintentionally that undermines the humanity of another person. Just want to take a second to give you a sense of what microaggressions are if you don't already know. They can include disrespecting someone's culture by refusing to learn about it and claiming ignorance, feeling entitled to touch someone's body, including their hair, and appraising such bodily elements, erasing a piece of someone else by refusing to pronounce their name correctly, use their pronouns, or the choice to broadcast sensitive information that has been shared in trust. Examples were outing sexuality or disability. The absence of such daily stressors means much more to the marginalized person than the relatively privileged person. However, when there is a concerted effort to make individual habitual shifts away from microaggressions and towards the expectation of difference, the deep and careful work of inclusion, that will decrease such constant stressors. As this good work proceeds, those who are marginalized will likely need far less elaborate self-protection measures to keep themselves safe. Intergroup tensions will likely decrease over time because with greater thoughtfulness and work on equitable access to needs-based solutions, competitions over resources can decrease. With community practice of habits of inclusion, work may well get done better, faster, because there's more honesty and connection, less negativity and reactivity to slow down the process of communicating. Everything I've said thus far is said with hope and the experience of trying to get things done in a coalition. But if we don't talk about sustainability, I'm not sure what it would all be for. Dedicated individuals all working at once to become more habitually inclusive, attuned to power and difference, inequality, and the work that needs to be done is a heady and hopeful thing, something that I love to talk about and am passionate about. However, such work must be sustainable for individuals, communities, workplaces, institutions. Otherwise, it will be a short-term concentration and not result in changed habits and culture, our hope for outcomes. Sustainability of changes in habit also requires slow work and growth, thoughtful, quiet changes that are not obvious. This is the difference between chipping away at a problematic socialization, old patterns of behaving, taking on greater responsibility for how we think and communicate versus performative acts. A performative act is the kind of inclusion work that looks good in the moment, but amounts to very little over time. It's often a one-time effort, words said and not sustained by behavior, and ultimately sows more distrust. This deep work of making real habituated changes in behavior, thinking, and the treatment of others comes from things like moving beyond binary thinking to yes and thinking, assuming difference between people, communities, and worldviews, being self-reflexive about our social location and how that informs our worldview and how we treat people, assuming that there are many facets to each person, many of which are not shared or do not have visible outward elements, and routinely thinking about how power operates, how structures maintain oppression, how inequality operates in the big picture as well as in daily interactions. These are difficult asks, and perhaps they're overwhelming or intimidating. A reflection question I'd like to pose at this point is, would you rather be part of this work or accept relationships, culture, and structures to remain as they are, unquestioned and just how things work. It is likely that the work benefits you in some very direct ways and in many more indirect ways. It is clear that this work benefits those who may not have access to the same resources as you, or may have different struggles than you. Such differences can be externalized through statements like, that's their issue, or internalized through an acceptance of our own role in this work by saying, this is work for all of us to do. Intersectionality is about power flowing. And as it does, some people become more susceptible to negative structural outcomes, which connect all the way down to daily interpersonal interactions. It means that you can be privileged in one area of your life and be oppressed in another. It can mean that people who have a single marginalization can gain greater access to resources because, but for their one marginalization, they would have access. The way through difficult work is to work together across difference. It's incredibly easy to say and very difficult to accomplish. It requires thinking about interconnections, similarities, the lack of parallels, the gaps of experience that cannot be bridged, what is not easily perceived, our own participation in the oppression of others, our mistakes, and our joyous collective successes. All of the small practices, the many conversations, and the time it takes to accomplish anything from this list is worthy. Intersectionality is often described using metaphors because the concept asks us to do work, and visualization sometimes helps span the gap from a concept to doing things. So let me trot a few out here. Intersectionality can be a mirror through which you view your own habits, your perception of self, your worldview, and if you engage in it, allyship work. Intersectionality can also be a lens, bringing into sharp focus moments where harm is done so that the work can be designed to address and prevent such harms in the future. Intersectionality can be a prism, casting light in many directions, many bits of light reflected across a situation or an experience, asking us to think carefully about the structures interacting, all the people and decisions involved that resulted in the need for action. It is through this structural and self-reflective labor that we can perceive what work needs to be done, how structure and power interact and interrelate, how those operations teach people how to conceive of themselves, others, and whether the world is just or not. When we are in positions of power, our worldviews and social attitudes form the world in big ways through policy, disbursement of material resources, as well as the treatment of others. And if we rise in power, we have the opportunity to bring justice-oriented thinking with us into rooms and conversations where it was previously absent, into policy construction and broad communication, into modeling behavior to other people about what is acceptable, what is the standard, what is required of us, and to all the issues and people that we refuse to leave out. Intersectionality reveals that structurally created negative outcomes compound, making lives ever more difficult. But so too can inclusive interventions compound, making negative outcomes less likely, directly naming and addressing structural inequality, shifting culture, creating much more robust access to resources and assistance, equity and fairness in treatment, and no lip service inclusion by making people know how valued they are by consistent behavior. By practicing habits of inclusion and working towards greater engagement with intersectionality as a practice, as labor to change our culture and our relationships for the better, we can only become more wise, more supportive, better problem solvers and listeners, educators, caregivers and leaders, community members, scholars, and activists. I offer a final set of reflection questions to practice thinking habit into action. An issue emerges, maybe it's a crisis, maybe a long-term need that requires greater focus. Reflect on the series of questions that follow as you try to imagine the difference the answers would make in preparation, planning, and action. What is the issue like based on racial and ethnic differences? Based on gender and gender identity differences? Based on sexuality? Based on differences in body and capacities? Based on class, religion or spirituality, citizenship status, other relevant factors like life conditions, community memberships? Where are there overlaps in need or overlaps in problems? Why are those overlaps happening? What circumstances are shared? Given what I now understand, how do I respond? What responsibilities do I have given who I am? When should I carefully consider what kinds of capacity and expertise I need to respond with? What else do I need to learn? Who else needs to be part of the solution? What is my commitment to this issue? Now, what is the next action? Given this last reflection, I hope there's greater clarity about how thinking shapes action and habit structures those chosen actions. Developing a broad vision for change requires gathering together critical players and community buy-in, active, meaningful, engaged support long-term. This requires coalition across difference, building or rebuilding community relationships, navigating those relationships, including dealing with suspicion, resentment, passion, deep need, which includes emotional, material, and financial needs, and the fear of being hurt or making a mistake. That vision and the subsequent action plans should not focus exclusively on one community or issue, for it will come at the cost of others and undermine all efforts related to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and the ultimate goal, justice. This means gathering together people across differences to openly discuss their needs and engage in labor to produce goals and outcomes that get the job done. Increasing community engagement, the deliberate and delicate development of trust is part of the practice. Sometimes that means failing hard, saying the wrong thing at the wrong moment, making an assumption that was unwise and led you in a bad direction. Not considering relevant factors, identities, communities, when planning for change or when addressing an issue. But fear of failure cannot stop us in the pursuit of a more just community and society. This work is too important and benefits too many of us. And sometimes that work is joyful. Audre Lorde wisely tells us that, quote, the sharing of joy forms a bridge between the sharers, which can be the basis for understanding much of what is not shared between them and lessens the threat of difference, end quote. How you arrive at that potential joy is through the unglamorous work of habit. And if there is one thing that I celebrate frequently, it is the unglamorous labor of habitually working to be more inclusive, equitable in action, and respectful of difference. By working on the challenge that intersectionality poses, to think carefully with people at the center, while assuming different struggles, strengths, and needs, that is the work that gets you closer to other people, closer to a future you hope for. Habit is an internal process as well as a community one. As you become ever more comfortable with self-reflection, asking yourself, how well did I do there? And am I becoming more well-attuned to the needs of others? And can I perceive structural inequality more readily than before? You will find greater ease in communication, less tension, more potential for meaningful dialogues. I know these things to be true because I have lived them and studied them teach and train about them, and hold myself accountable to working on them. I know them to be true, especially because people who are not like me have similar life experiences and insights, ever more so folks who don't have the privileges that I do. And as part of my practice of doing this work, I choose to believe people when they speak or write, when they take a risk and explain their need or their struggle. And I am grateful to the many people who trusted me with their wisdom and scholarship and community building efforts so that I may have the opportunity to share mine with you today. My profound thanks to all of you for attending and watching. For those that are interested, if you're watching now or later, I'm happy to provide additional resources for you to continue learning and thinking through these issues.
Hi, Dr. Brennan. There's one question if you could address for us. A lot of the students that might be watching here are first generation, first year students. So they're learning kind of to adapt to the new, scenario of being away from home, away from their comfort zones and in a new environment. What are some of the biggest issues related to intersectionality and language and habit inclusion that do you think students should be prepared for, or some things that they should do to kind of adjust to this new environment?
That's a great and I think urgent question as well. I've worked with a lot of first gen folks, and in my own experience, one of the problems I had is in higher education. I think this is true in workforce and having a job or working on a career. I think you need, as much as you can find, as early as you can find, mentors who can teach you how to do things before you have to learn how to do them yourself. So it's one thing for you to be incredibly intelligent. It is another thing if you're entering into an environment where you do not have the playbook because no one around you had the playbook. That is a fundamentally different thing. And no matter how gifted you are, how intelligent, how driven, what a fantastic human you are, there's a big gap in experiential knowledge if you have never had conversations with somebody else going where you want to go. And whether that's going to a 4-year degree program, or if that's going to graduate school, or if that's trying to get a particular internship, or whatever it is, you've got to find someone who's just even a little bit ahead of you, who's willing to be honest and real with you. And if at all possible, find someone who has something directly in common with you. I say this from my own experience. When I was an undergraduate, there was one Latino professor that I knew. We were not close, even though I was very carefully watching how he negotiated the environment when I could. I had a number of people who supported me robustly, and I really appreciated that. but there were a lot of gaps between us. Many of them were not first generation students. Many of them were white. Most of them were straight. And so while I had really a team of supportive people, that was not the same thing as at least having one mentor who has a similar difference as you do. And in particular for first generation students, I think being able to find someone you can trust to be real with and say, this thing happened today, I'm not sure how to handle it, or I want to prepare for this thing and I don't know how to negotiate that as me. What are your ideas? And if you don't know, can you help me connect with somebody else who does? And so that's the first part of that. And then the second part of that is there is not enough conversation, I think, anywhere nationally for first generation students about how outside they will likely feel. Higher education is classed and raced. It is classed as middle class or more. It is raced as white. And so in that environment, there are certain protocols, ways of being, acting, thinking, and that feeling on the outside can really do detrimental harm and invalidate you and make you feel like you don't belong. And so when I say diversity, equity, inclusion, and I put belonging on there, I really mean it, because you've got to be teaching people that they should be taking up space there as well and supporting them. It is not enough to recruit, for example, students of color or first generation students or queer and trans students. It is not enough to recruit them if you do not have meaningful material resources and people behind them to support them for 4 years while they are there, or longer, depending on their needs. And so what would I say to students? If that's the reality, then find a way by watching, if you're still working on that mentor, to figure out how other people are operating so you can put your own playbook together. And unfortunately, what that means is marginalized people are really smart at reading other people in situations because they have to do that. So those are the two initial parts. I have a lot more to say, but I see another question in the chat. What are some tactics you use to confront someone who you feel might have a microaggression against you? It can be awkward conversation to speak up. Oh, it's always an awkward conversation. The first thing I would say is, if you can, and this is a big ask and it's not always appropriate, so this is a use your best judgment moment. If you can, I would take them aside separately. So rather than doing it in front of people, which can unfortunately increase the reactivity towards you, which is what I do not want. I do not want more microaggressions or more hostility coming your way. So this is really about self-protection and not protecting their feelings. But to be able to take someone aside separately and say, hey, you said this thing. I didn't appreciate it. It made me feel negative. Maybe you want to elaborate on that. Maybe you don't, because you don't owe them depth of information. You do, I think, well for yourself when you confront the issue directly, which doesn't have to be a fight. It can just be literally saying direct things. I didn't appreciate when you did that. It made my day much harder. And I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but these kinds of things happen to me all the time on a daily basis. And it makes working, living, thinking so much harder, because I have this thing that distracted me, that maybe it did some harm to me, that I'm going to be thinking about a lot unnecessarily while I'm trying to be productive and do all of these good things that people appreciate. And I really don't want anything detracting from my life like that. So in the future, could you do your best to not do not only that one thing, but anything that would be similar to that? Now, the person might be unaware of the kind of impact that they have on you. And they also might be unaware and also dismissive of somebody coming to them and saying, hey, you did this thing, I'd really like you to address it. If I am able to, if I have the capacity, I'm going to bring that up again. If I'm able to, I do my best to give someone the opportunity to learn something very directly because I said it to them and they don't have to guess about it. But also that means accountability, because the second I say it very directly in a way that can't be confused, that means I expect action from the other person if they're operating in good faith. The reality is that once you directly tell somebody this, hey, you did this thing and it really impacted me negatively, and I don't want you to do that or similar things again, the most likely responses are one of three: silence, because they don't know how to operate in those situations, which isn't surprising because they're not doing this work. So they're not comfortable with doing it. 2 is reactivity. Well, I didn't mean it that way and I didn't know. And so how am I supposed to know? Which a reply to that is, but you do need to know that because you have more power than I do. Or you do need to know that because I am marginalized in this way and perhaps you are not. And so it's your responsibility to learn these kinds of things because I do this when I am not marginalized. So I would hope that you would take up that responsibility. And the third, most likely, is suddenly asking you for a bunch of information. What does microaggression mean? Why are you upset? Why was this something negative? And I encourage everyone in that position not to answer and to say, I appreciate that you want to address this. I really appreciate that you want to learn. That's fantastic. And follow that, please. But I am not the lexicon of information about this. And there are plenty of free resources for you to learn all about this. In fact, there are lots of people in higher education who are paid to learn about this, to teach about this, to train about this. And I encourage you to seek out some of those free resources. And if not, perhaps to connect with professionals who can explain this to you better. But my role was to bring it up to you so that you could do something about it. And I'm glad to see that you're that level of interested in doing something about it. But it is not my job to teach you all the things that you need to know. I hope that answered the question.
All right, as we're closing out on this hour, do you have anything to close or any final statements or anything that you can share with the crowd before we wrap it up?
Thanks. I would just say that this kind of work can be flashy and performative and for personal gain, or it can be the commitment of a lifetime to slowly chip away at it. I hope I've given you a sense that there are people out there who are not performative, who are not looking for a round of applause, who do these behaviors on a daily basis and are constantly seeing where they can do better and level up. I hope that I'm counted as one of those people. I try to hold myself accountable as possible, but know that there are people who actually care and devote their lives to doing this kind of labor because they think it's transformative, and not just in their own personal lives or in their inner circle or at work or at school, but that they think that if enough people buy in, if enough people believe that these kinds of changes will actually help people, that they're in and they'll continue to do this kind of work in their own lives and in the lives of other people that they touch for a lifetime. And I truly believe that if there are enough people, a critical mass of people who are willing to do labor and put in the effort, that is going to result in cultural change and not just the moments of major shift where we fall into each other's arms and we celebrate and we say, we've been waiting for this for so long. It's such a relief that the good thing has happened. But the slow positive creep of people buying in and getting the work done and influencing others in positive ways, I think that's a kind of cultural shift that's worth working for a lifetime to see how far you get.
All right, thank you so much for your presentation and for answering the questions. This video will be published on our YouTube channel, so if anybody wants to rewatch it or take some notes from it, it will be available. So thank you, Dr. Brennan, for your presentation this evening.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.